You know, I've known Ubayd for a long time. He's gotten to know me for a long time. And we've said this many times before, and I've been honored to know him for as long as I have, alhamdulillah. But today we're just trying to have a real discussion, brother to brother, about what's happening. So, Ubayd, how you been, bro?
Alhamdulillah, I want to thank you for a very generous introduction. And don't need to tell you, but I want everyone else to know that the respect is mutual, the admiration and the affection are also mutual. And I think it's very courageous of you to, engage a topic like this when many of us are still thinking about this. One of the great perils of, I guess, public intellectual life is that you're forced to think out loud. Um, Oftentimes, we speak and we're not offering positions that have been well worked, interned, and considered, and adjusted and amended. We're in between thinking and feeling. Um, and in that way, our task really resembles the task of artists more than it does the task of scholars. So, like an artist, we ask for the indulgence of the audience, and we ask for their grace and their husn dhan in anything we say that might, trouble, offend, upset sensibilities. Inshallah. But I've been, you know, all things considered, I've been well. A tough, a tough week, very, very tough week. Very tough time I've had since Eid. Just again, feeling and so many different emotions. Saying that I'm conflicted is something of an understatement, really. But trying my best.
Well, I mean, I think before we go into maybe some of the conflictions, I think we do justice for us. So much has transpired since the last Tuesday that we met, you and I, on this platform. You know,
Mm.
Eid came, we were all in immense celebration, and there was
Sure.
we're talking
Really.
about the realities inwardly and outwardly about all of that. And then just a few days later, we see and we witness a horrific death within our American community by the hands of a cop who who did something in so many ways that I cannot explain except say pornographically violent in a way, in
Mm.
front of in such a casual way that
Hmm.
hit such a visceral reaction in many Americans' lives to be able to witness something like that that has propelled us into something that for some might be new, for others might be something that
Mm.
they've been known about and been talking about for years. And
Mm.
this is where we are right now. I wanted to backtrack to that before we go into the states of where we're at right now, because I want to do justice to see how that trajectory was for us as we ran through it, just
Mm.
you and I.
Yeah, no, I think I, like everybody else, made the mistake of watching the entire video, and it was gross. It was disgusting. It was infuriating. Um, it was maddening. It literally drove you crazy to watch this man strangle, right, or asphyxiate George Floyd, placing his knee on his neck while he was already in custody, right? The man is in custody. The man is handcuffed. He has his hands behind his back. The idea that he could have even resisted arrest in the state that he was in is absolutely preposterous. And the video captured exactly what transpired. I mean, it was a casual disregard for George Floyd's life. And the thing that struck me perhaps hardest is that he had his hand in his pocket. He had his hand in his pocket. Which I think just typified this kind of casual disregard. and he taunted George Floyd, telling him to get up and get into the car, asking him with exasperation in his voice, "What do you want?" And as a fully grown man, told him that he couldn't breathe. As people that were watching told him that he couldn't breathe, as he heard this man call for his mother, who is deceased. His mother, at the time he was calling for his mother was deceased. The fact that nothing of his humanity suggested that he get up from George Floyd, it was actually quite horrifying, man. I was angry, not simply at the act, in and of itself, but the culture that produced the callous disregard for George Floyd's life, that animated Derek Chauvin, and I would say even desensitized the onlookers to some degree. I mean, people spoke, but seeing somebody being asphyxiated, you would hope that we would act in a more forceful way. We would intervene in a more forceful way. But these are police officers. They are sanctioned to use their weapons. So I'm not blaming anybody for cowardice in just filming or witnessing, but I do think that filming and that witnessing speaks to a kind of normalcy with which we approach, the unsolicited premature death of poor African Americans in economically devastated, socially devastated, neighborhoods.
Yeah. So right now, what you mentioned was like there was a culture that was set behind it. Can you explain a little bit about what you meant by that?
I think one thing that I think was at play there is this culture of that suggests that Black people have higher thresholds of pain than other kinds of people, so that normally if someone is telling you I can't breathe, or a person is you're applying unwanted pressure to some part of a person's body, and they tell you that hurts, that is normally a signal to adjust what you're doing, because you believe that you're hurting them, because they're telling you that you're hurting them. In the case of George Floyd, what I found really infuriating is that even when he was telling him that he couldn't breathe, and other people were telling him that he couldn't breathe, even after he was unconscious, he still had his knee upon his neck. And what was even more, I think, telling was that he did not, Officer Derek Chauvin did not appear to be enraged. Sometimes when a person is, enraged, right? This is why the Prophet ﷺ talks about don't become angry, because when a person is enraged, your ability to process reality is altered. It's fragmented. It's. I mean, you're not all the way there.
Yeah, some people even black out, right? Some people even black out.
He wasn't enraged. He wasn't enraged. The only thing that we can conclude is that he could casually disregard this man saying, "I can't breathe." And so I think, something to me suggests that this is a larger issue. But what he did was, I think, typical, was representative of some of those larger issues in terms of how we regard, Black life generally, and particularly Black men.
Yeah, so everything that happened transpired, and then the world kind of took notice of well, the reality of what many people in America face on a daily basis, right? And then what ends up happening is people start taking to the streets in protests, right?
Ali, somebody just messaged me and they said that the link to the talk is not working.
No, I believe we fixed that. Everything is fine, inshallah. It should be okay.
Okay, inshallah.
They
Okay.
can go on the website, or they can also catch it on Facebook, inshallah, if you'd like to tell them.
Okay, let me just tell them. Hold on.
Yeah, there's no problem. So again, everyone, we're here together for purification of the heart. And in case you missed the intro of what we were talking about, we were speaking about everything that's going on around us today. We're joined by Ubaydullah Evans, who usually hosts the class, alhamdulillah, and teaches the class of purification of the heart. But because of everything that's going on around us, we felt that him and I having a discussion of what's happening around us today, a real discussion between two people with perspectives and views of what's happening to try to understand the reality around us would be extremely beneficial to everyone. And inshallah, by next week, we'll be digging in right back in the usual course of studying from the book page to page. But today, we might dabble again into some realities of purification of the heart within the context of what we're talking about. Inshallah. And Ubaid and I were just covering like how we kind of witnessed the beginning of what was happening from the time of the passing of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, to be very honest with everyone, and till now. And now we're moving past that in a chronological order to when everyone started taking to the streets in a peaceful
Mm-hmm.
protesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was
Right.
a huge support system from what seems like the media and others that hasn't really been there in the past when it comes to
Mm.
others who have passed in such tragedy.
Yeah, no, I think there was something about this, man. There was something about this that I think struck a chord with everyone who witnessed the tape. I think maybe it had something to do with the fact that this came on the heels of the global pandemic, and we're already in a kind of a state of reflection. You know, we've been sheltering in place. There have been stay-at-home orders, and I think that is probably what contributed. Because I mean, this isn't the first police murder of this kind. Eric Garner was killed in a similar fashion. Recently, Breonna Taylor was killed as someone entered her home without serving any warrant and just opened fire.
Right.
Ahmaud Arbery was killed by an ex-police officer and his son that were engaged in vigilantism. So it's not the first of this kind of gruesome killing, but there was something about the timing of this killing, and I think the way that it was captured. You actually heard this man, take his last breath. You heard him, speak his last words, and you heard him essentially begging for his life. And I think it was something about the combination of those factors that spurred people to action, and people took to the streets. And taking to the streets is necessary. I'm always amazed at how when these become issues of public concern, things move much more quickly, and the state makes decisions that seem a bit more sensible. So we've learned today that all 4 officers have been charged, in the slaying of George Floyd. Um, in the case of like the Ahmaud Arbery case, that happened in February, and no charges were filed. See that, like, I think it's very hard for someone to. It might be hard to sympathize or empathize with what that says to me, what that says to my wife, that this man was wrongfully killed, murdered, right, while out jogging by 2 vigilantes that assumed because he was Black and he was running, that he was responsible for a string of break-ins that had taken place in their community. right? He was followed, he was tracked. And then when he attempted to defend himself, he was brutally murdered, shot with a shotgun at close range. And that entire county, that entire township was prepared to just say, oops, mistakes happen. No charges were filed. Who knows what conversations were had behind closed doors? Oops, thought it was somebody else. This is quickly swept, under the rug, and life is continued as if nothing ever happened. What does that say? That kind of failure to administer justice. What does that say about the value of that man's life? You understand what I'm saying? But when people took to the streets, when people spoke volubly about this injustice, then we see charges being filed. Now, both of those men are charged with murder. Now, all 4 officers are charged with murder. Now, there is, I was saying that I think it's very easy to summarily dismiss, the claim of progress in terms of how we are dealing with race and structural racism. But, I do feel a difference. I was 10 in 1992, and I remember distinctly the Rodney King verdict, and I remember the riots. And you didn't see nearly as much identification with the problem. There was much more denial. There was much more fragility. There was much more polarity when the Rodney King beating took place. I remember that. Even though I was 10, I still remember watching news networks and listening to public debates, and you got the sense that there was something to debate about, right? Even though that beating was filmed. In the case of the George Floyd killing, you get the sense that there's much less to debate about. Even people who are not known for their affection towards Black communities are clear that this was a murder. Many law enforcement professionals have, taken to the airwaves saying that is not a legitimate procedure. That is completely uncalled for. It was completely unnecessary. So I think that there has been some movement, but I think people taking to the streets is necessary to continue raising awareness about the fact that we won't stand for this. Enough is enough.
Yeah. And so that brings us to 2 things, right? The first thing would say that, some people now would say, like, taking it to the street, to what end, right? What does that mean, taking it to the street?
Yeah.
I've seen that a lot now in my WhatsApp groups, between my friends, different dialogues. It's extremely sensitive, extremely sensitive. There's others that are, there's others that are saying, right, that this is just brick and mortar and then it'll be fixed the next day. Are you saying that that's more than the life of someone, right? Is that worth more than someone? And then there's others saying, like,
that is such a false dichotomy. That is such a false dichotomy. Anyone that suggests that looting and vandalism are wrong is in no way saying that brick and mortar is more important than the life of George Floyd or the lives of countless African Americans that are circumscribed by racism and white supremacy. I don't hear anybody making that juxtaposition, but I do hear people questioning whether or not destroying property will in any way contribute to a constructive dialogue about how we can solve this problem. And one of the things that I've accepted about this, I don't, I make, no bones about it. how you ultimately feel about vandalism and the destruction of property and the loss of stability will probably boil down to just how much you have invested in what is being disturbed, in what is being destroyed, in what is being vandalized. And I think, to assume that any of us can speak, or to assume that a person should speak beyond that very clear kind of self-interest, or a person can speak beyond that kind of self-interest, I think is asking a lot of anybody. For myself, my neighborhood was hit very hard.
In Bedford,
Lots of Bronzeville.
in Brownsville.
Bronzeville. My neighborhood was hit pretty hard. Ironically, many of the Black-owned businesses were not touched, right? But Walmart was hit pretty hard. Dollar Tree was hit pretty hard. Discount clothing store Ross was hit pretty hard. Walgreens was hit pretty hard, and a few other establishments, were ransacked. And a part of me, naturally felt like, wow, I'm trying to invest, in this neighborhood. When I was considering buying a home, I was very deliberate about wanting to live in Bronzeville. I was very deliberate about wanting to live in a historically Black community that I thought was very charming and that I thought, contained great potential. And I had been recently considering, acquiring some commercial property, thinking about either doing something around the stuff that I've been doing with woodworking and furniture,
Right.
or just getting some, rental property, attempting to do some Airbnb and stuff like that. This is where I'm raising my family. This is where my children live. I like to come out of my doors, and I like my neighborhood to be inspiring. I don't like to see desolation. I don't like to see my neighborhood look dispirited. I don't like, I like to see, marks and traces of ihsan in the place that I live. I think that's very natural. Also, I did worry about, what does this mean for my property value? What does this mean for some of the plans that I had to, engage, some commercial interests, in this area? What does all of this mean for me personally? And I think that's a natural feeling to have if you're me, because I have something to lose. I have something invested in the stability and infrastructure of my neighborhood. On the other, locked out of some of the privileges that I've enjoyed, and who perhaps feel none of that fealty, none of that allegiance, none of that investment, in the neighborhood, that would, throw a Molotov cocktail into a store, or run into a store and ransack it. I've had to come to terms with the gulf of, social and economic inequality that divides me from that person. You know what I'm saying? Our perspectives differ, and I've tried to recognize that, and I've tried to withhold judgment, because maybe I just, it's very hard for me to see it, like someone that had much less invested than I. It's very hard for me to see it from the same perspective as someone that wasn't hoping for development and growth, and some commercial maturation, in this neighborhood. But I do recognize that even those terms I'm spitting out, growth and development and maturation, etc., it would have inevitably excluded some people. You know what I'm saying? And I think people that feel most marginalized are perhaps people that, are perhaps the people that are, least inclined to have some protectiveness, over the community, but I'm just trying to withhold judgment and trying to put the best possible construction on what I see taking place. Even the protests that grow violent, even the looting, even the vandalism. I'm trying to withhold my judgment, recognizing the subjectivity of my own sense about it. But as a Muslim, I do recognize that demolition, destroying things, even if we deem it to be a necessary step in a process of change. Let's say we're building a house and we recognize that the house is termite infested and it has to come down. We have to break the house down. We have to tear the house down to its qawaid, to its foundations. This house cannot be salvaged. This house cannot be repaired. I realized that when it comes to the demolition of the house, yeah, I probably need the supervision of an architect, right? To tell people, don't hit this structural beam, the ceiling might collapse, right? But you don't need that much expertise. If I get, some strong people, equip them with sledgehammers, they will probably be able to knock the place down to its foundations. When it is time to rebuild that house, I will need skilled artisans. I will need craftspeople. I will need electricians. I will need pipe fitters. I will need stonemasons, bricklayers, plumbers, carpenters. I will need all kinds of special skills and special expertise. And this is where I hope we see ourselves as Muslims. People are frustrated with the American status quo, and some people are so frustrated that they want to shake it to its very foundations. We should be thinking about how we can live together in community, providing models of how people of different ethnic backgrounds and different socioeconomic statuses and different professions and different views and different opinions can live together in a way that there's no such thing as a utopia, on earth, but certainly reflects true goodwill toward each other. And so, even if I view this as a necessary step, kind of the tearing down and the burning and the destroying, my focus as a Muslim is on building. I'm a builder. My focus is on, the proactive construction of a culture that, intentionally rivals, what people are out there protesting against.
Right. So where I'm at right now is I just want to kind of dig a little deeper, Ubayd. We did say in the beginning of this, thing, and for those of you that are maybe watching right now, like, this is not me talking as Ali Dia ED, right, of Khalif, or Ali Dia the chiropractor, or and this is not Ubayd talking as like Ubayd the ustad and scholar that we all know and love, but this is just him and I having a chat about real conversations that might be circling everyone's radar right now. And so I'm gonna give it to you real, Ubayd. Like, my background, right? You kind of know me more than most people, right? My background is that I was born in Damascus, Syria, right? And then we came to America when I was like 4 or 5 years old, something like that. And my whole life, though, from the moment that I can remember till now, my father had this love and great appreciation for none other than Muhammad Ali, right? The boxing. And so much so that he named his first son, me, after the man. And he would tell me that's my namesake, right? We know Muhammad Ali is a Black American Muslim, probably the most influential Black American Muslim that we might have witnessed in our lives.
No problem. No problem. No problem.
Well, I got a few others in my mind, like Malcolm and whatnot. But for me, as in my trajectory of living, I remember growing up watching my dad watch him, right? my dad emulate him, even when me and my dad are like, when he's teaching me how to throw a punch, he's teaching me through the lens of Muhammad Ali, right? From what he's, and I grow up in that trajectory. I come to America, and I grow up in different areas within the Chicagoland area, right? The greater Chicagoland area. And then what happens is um, I hit a certain love and appreciation for Malcolm X, right? And those are the two that I identify with the most, that start formalizing my understanding, my identity, right? Organically, as an Arab Muslim in America, right? And then I grow up a little bit more, and growing up in the '90s with the Chicago Bulls, it's organic that the third role model there would be Michael Jordan, MJ, right? So
You went way down, man. You went
yeah,
way down from Ali to
yeah.
Malcolm X
I'm just
to
being real.
MJ.
I'm just
You
being
went
real.
way you went way down, man.
I'm just being,
Although I mean that's said by somebody that was a literal Michael Jordan tabia. I was a literal Michael Jordan. I mean, everything he did, I attempted to emulate. So,
yeah.
I'm not ridiculing you for that.
No, I know. We share our same love of that. Throughout Ramadan, we were talking about the last dance a lot, right?
Sure.
But what I'm trying to get at is that my identity was formalized very much so by Black American Islam in a very direct and a very indirect way. And now that this is happening, and I'm being very real here with the audience and with you, and I'm putting myself out there, now that this is happening, when you have that type of upbringing growing up, and you have that type of relation and that comfort in that zone where you actually feel at home, and then when stuff like this happens, and then you want to help and you want to be a part of, and then you realize, oh wait, I need to take a step back here. I don't really realize everything that's going on. Where do I fit in that, and being able to assist and help without offending and without sounding like a person who's trying to come in finally to help a situation when, bro, like this has been going on. You don't know much about this.
Yeah, no, it's very difficult, man. I think that we have to all take a step back, and we have to realize that when we're talking about anti-Black racism, and we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about I think even to call these ideologies is something of a misnomer, because an ideology requires a conscious commitment to the ideology. If I'm a communist, I'm a communist, right? If I'm a socialist, I'm a socialist, right? If I'm an Islamist, which is a word that I hate, but I like to give my examples in threes. I should have thought about something, a different word.
No Islamist exists.
What is that, right? But ideologies. My point is simply that ideologies require conscious commitments to them. These are ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of speaking, ways of seeing that can exist, at a subconscious level, right? I think that sometimes when we're talking about, what people experience, what a lot of Black people experience, I think people are quick to exonerate themselves. No, I'd never, are quick to talk about, their own histories, their own biographies, and they're quick to kind of reference them as a way of displaying that, I have great affinity and great respect and great indebtedness to African Americans and to Black people and to African American Islam, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that we have to get to a place of being able to talk about some of these issues in a way that does not negate, right? We can talk about these issues in an unguarded way, in a straightforward way, but in a way that does not negate personal goodwill, personal good character, in a way that does not indict anybody. This is, bro, I'm gonna tell you, when I'm thinking about some of these things and how we understand them, I would be the first to admit that I'm impacted. Me. I'm impacted, man. These are, this is a way of thinking, a way of knowing that impacts me, that I am trying to divest of. So if that's me, and I want to think that I'm somewhat self-aware, then what about you? That's me. I mean, sometimes it's very simple things that we find ourselves doing or saying, assumptions that we find ourselves making. You know what I'm saying? And if we're not careful and we don't ask, where does that assumption come from? Why did I do that? Or why did I say that? Or why do I frame that issue in that way? It might be something that went unexamined. So I'll give you just an example of what I'm talking about. Even the way that I think well-meaning people talk about affirmative action. Look at an issue like affirmative action, right? In quotas. The issue is framed, should a minority student that is objectively less deserving of a seat or a job, a seat, at a university or a job, be given the priority over a white student, right? A white male student, that, because the biggest recipient, the biggest beneficiary of affirmative action has actually been white women, but over a white male student that is objectively more qualified, right? Has a more impressive CV or resume. And it's almost like, just think about that for a minute. When you frame the issue in that way, and I've heard people arguing on both sides, framing the issue in that way, you don't even question. Wait a minute, wait a second. If we really truly believe in not the equality of outcomes, because I think a mythic belief in equality of outcomes is not always true, but that talent and ability among different categories of people exist in similar proportion. That you have some geniuses here and you have some geniuses here. You have some mediocre folks here and you have some mediocre folks there. You have some underachieving folks here and you have some underachieving folks there. If we really believe that, then what we would be asking is, what is it about either the situation or how we're assessing ability that is suppressing or not allowing us to see the brilliance of these people, because we know that they have it. Do you understand what I'm saying? But when we don't frame the issue in that way, we're taking for granted Black underachievement, right? And that's something that I might do, right? Or when we speak in certain ways. I was listening to one teacher, very committed educator. He said, I work at a predominantly Black school, but it's high achieving. Why use the conjunction but? Because he's saying what the norm is, and this is someone committed to the education, to the edification of his students. But that framing is still a part of his thinking.
Right.
But no, I work at a predominantly Black school and it's high achieving. So even asking himself, and this is someone that has probably done more. This was a white man. He's probably done more for young Black students than I ever will. And he still thinks like that. He's still that slip of the tongue. So we're talking about something that's bigger than personal morality. And I think we have to approach these conversations in that way if we want to get anywhere.
So how do we approach it in the sense of the Muslim realm? Because the reality is, a lot of folks might be upset with me when I bring this up. But man, our Muslim communities are obviously 100% subjugated to this type of.
But and this is what I was gonna say, actually, man. But everybody is, man. I think, to place the singular onus on Muslims in terms of eradicating racism, dude, we are still a community attempting to forge a path forward inside the larger American socioeconomic political context.
Yes.
You know, and we're not insulated from the factors that influence kind of general views on race and class and ethnicity, etc. So I think what it requires in our community is a very deliberate commitment to a countervailing narrative, just a very deliberate commitment to it. You know what I'm saying? And one thing, and this is going to be unpopular. This is going to be unpopular. I know that this is going to be unpopular. Man, at the end of the day, Ali, I'm gonna be as honest as I can with you.
This is what this is about. You and I just being honest.
No. I'm gonna be as honest as I can with you. Yes, I think we can work on, and I personally, I don't even put a great deal of stock into this, but some people, when they think about, dealing with racism in a substantive way, they think about language policing, right? Which is kind of what I was just talking about, saying a high achieving and as opposed to but, saying enslaved person as opposed to slave, saying, not saying he's so articulate, but rather saying eloquent. I mean, these kinds of this, and I think that there's some about, if I'm expressing any exasperation or frustration, it's only because I think there's a subset of liberal thinkers who this is what racial equity looks like to them: language policing. Don't say this, but say this. Don't say this, but do this. And I'm like, okay, I think that this is good, but to me, this is like human resources, man. These are the concerns of people that work together or study together and things like that. And I think it's a good starting point just to make sure that environments are welcoming and we don't say things that that intentionally offend other people. That's a good start. That's okay, but we can't get stuck there, man. Sometimes an overemphasis on language policing is I don't know. Sometimes I think it can actually be counterproductive to people being able to engage each other in real human encounter when there's all of these crazy language filters that we have to adopt to even speak to each other. But I understand the sentiment. You can talk about support, right? That we're giving, we're very charitable, we're very philanthropic because we do recognize that there's an economic imbalance in the community, and we're attempting to address that, and that often takes the form of philanthropy. There can be the issue of representation, that we do realize that we are deeply indebted to the African American Muslim community for creating a vibrant place, especially in America's inner cities, for Islam and Muslims. And the fact that I can walk down the street with my head held high as a Muslim is because of the work of African American Muslims. And I think that's all of those are very beneficial places to begin our exploration of how we deal with race in the community. But at some point, Ali, it won't be real until we live together and we educate our children together. I'm just being, because if we fail to do that, and we pray together, that's that, right? But if we live together, we pray together, and we educate our children together, because only in those three departments, and I'm seeing those as representative of different, fields of human endeavor, only then will we really be interrupting a chain, interrupting a system of the American status quo that doles out privileges to people who get closer to whiteness. Only then when our resources and livelihood is shared in that way, will we really be able to kind of stake a claim to like doing something different. Because at the end of the day, I still live in a place that I live. And I still send my children to school where I send my children to school. And I still have access, because of where I live, to the goods and services that I have access to. And you, even though we're in community with one another, you don't have any of that. And even though I would like to take an active interest in you improving your lot, I give zakah, I give sadaqah. The idea that I would ever share with you in what I have in a mu'akhah, in a brothering kind of way, right? This brothering between the muhajirun and the ansar, and that I would see that partnership as mutually beneficial, that I have something to give and something to gain. I still think that, and I'm not saying that there's any quick way of doing this. I'm not suggesting that everybody sell their home and move to, this or that neighborhood. But I think as long as we live apart, as long as we educate our children apart, and as long as we pray apart, the way that we're addressing race in our community will always resemble the status quo. It's like, yeah, there's more kind of personal affection between us, and we're very respectful to each other when speaking to each other, but I still live here and you still live there. And the quality of life indices in your neck of the woods are much higher than mine. And the prospects that your children enjoy are much different than the prospects that my children enjoy. And even though we might acknowledge that as a kind of, it's unfortunate, it does suggest some complicity. Even if I guess we do that, maybe we do that in a, c'est la vie, thus is life, or, tafadul fil arzaq, there's tafadul, there's difference in rizq, and there's nothing we can do about that, Ubayd. I get all of that. And by the way, people living together does not in any way entail a sameness, that, you're a chiropractor and this person is, works in facilities management at a high school, and that you guys should have the same car and the same food and the same house and the same, but in what ways are you together? That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that we have to live together as in we all live in Bronzeville or we all live in Bridgeview, for that matter. But in what ways are our lives intertwined in a way that really involves sharing? I think that's what it really comes down to. And I think that when our lives are intertwined in that way, in a way that really, I think, entails sharing, this is something that will prove mutually beneficial, for all of us, right? I think that kind of sharing, that kind of engagement, just contains manifold benefits, for everybody that gets involved in it. I think it would relieve, some of the second and third, generation immigrant Muslims of, any insecurity they have about their patriotism, about their belonging, because now you're in community with people who, for everything that is said about African Americans, no one ever doubts the belongingness of Black people in America. Never, right? Never. Maybe somebody irrationally, but nobody speaking sensibly, right? And also too, Ali, I say this unapologetically. And if somebody wants to argue with me, they'll be wrong, but, they can argue with me. I really feel like the African American community has the highest moral authority of any community in the world. I really believe that. As the highest moral authority of any community in the world. That in spite of everything that community has experienced, there was never any the formation of any wholesale lynch mobs going out attacking, white people. You know, there was never, you know, any suicide bombers that strapped explosives to their bodies and ran inside of majority white context and imploded themselves. It never happened. Never happened. Never happened. In fact, I would venture to say that much of African American history is kind of like Yusuf alayhi salam, being removed from prison and then serving the society, helping the society in which he was wrongly imprisoned to escape the would-be negative consequences of famine. So Yusuf is released from prison and he's serving the society that wrongly imprisoned him and enslaved him. I think there's much to be gained, right? There's much to be gained through that kind of partnership, not only for the African American community or the Black American community, but for our brothers and sisters. I think there's much to be gained, in that affiliation. Speaking of Philistine in particular, one local politician told me the thing that would be most devastating to Israel is a real coalition between the Black Caucus and people that are serious about Israel and Palestine. He said, because just as was the case in apartheid, African Americans still have a special voice when it comes to denouncing the systemic, immorality of this country and other countries. And if that voice was being lent to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it could put some pressure in some places. You see what I'm saying? That's what I mean by moral authority. It could put some pressure in some places. The way that people can go on television and just disrespectfully talk about Muslims with no fear of recourse, right? Nightly news. It's very hard to do the same thing with the African Americans. Person might do it, but there's going to be some swift reprisals. Believe that, right? That's what I mean by moral authority, right? Even what we're seeing now with these protests, it's if you say Black Lives Matter, there's a moral authority that is assumed there. That anyone that's even halfway familiar and acquainted with America's history realizes that, it's subhanAllah, that's it's real. That's moral authority. Muslims need some of that in order to do our work in this country. We need some of that moral authority, right? At the same time, I think, a great deal can be gained by Black Americans through that kind of intertwined living that I'm imagining. And I'm not sure how that looks. I'm not saying we all have to be neighbors, but, in what way are we really sharing? I think there would be a great deal to be gained, by African Americans, materially and other materially. So, that's what I think it really, really comes down to. And I think we have to seek a space that we can have that conversation, in a constructive way.
That was a lot. Mashallah.
Yeah.
And I think some people might not agree with everything being said. Some people might, but where I'm at right now is, this is a real conversation about how we're feeling, right? My one thing that I'm trying to understand is, it's been on my mind since this whole situation's taking place, Ubayd, and one of the things that it is Maghrib time. That's what
Yeah.
I know you well. But the one thing that comes to mind is, and this is purification of the heart, right? Now, racism in the context of the US, right, as opposed to racism
Hmm.
and understanding of it in a Muslim lens context traditionally through ulama and scholars. That's what I want to understand.
Hmm.
How does that differ in its understanding, if it does at all, right? Because for us, we say racism can come from arrogance, and it could come from ujub, right?
Hmm.
And so having those thought processes, would it still be in the same understanding to get to the root cause of that racism? Like I'm asking,
You
like
know, what, Akeem, I actually don't believe, and this is just, my own kind of, free interpretive thinking. I actually don't think that racism, I think if we were diagnosing racism and trying to look at its, ideology, where it comes from, I don't see it coming from ujub. I don't see it coming from ujub. I don't think, when I think of a racist,
can you translate that so people know what we're talking about?
ujub is arrogance or conceit. Mu'ajab bi nafsi, a person that is uh, pleased with himself, more
Yeah,
literally amazed,
amazed with those.
with himself. Mu'ajab bi nafsi. I don't. I actually think that um, racism comes from uh, taqleel. Um, how would I translate this? A kind of a تقليل فضل الله تعالى. It comes from a truncation in terms of how one believes in the favor of God. That's where racism comes from.
Like a
I
be
think that
like a belittling? Is that what you mean?
no, like an underestimation. You
Underestimate.
see what I'm saying? Like an underestimation of God's favor. Istihqar, or like an underestimation of God's favor. That's what لا يقدرون الله حق قدره. Right? This idea that one is so insecure in what they are or what they've been given that to see any of it ceded to someone else feels like defeat. It feels like loss, right? So when Shaitan sees Adam being honored, I don't think that his feeling is ujub. I think his feeling is there's something being diminished. Something of who I am is being diminished by him being honored. Do you see what I'm saying? By him being elevated, something within me is being diminished. And I think it comes down to recognizing that there's enough fadl, there's enough favor for this person to be honored and nothing be diminished in what I am or what I have, that I am not elevated through the subjugation of anyone else. That's what I really think. If I'm looking at kind of the spiritual root cause of racism, the hadith that actually comes to mind for me is لَقَدْ حَجَّرْتَ شَيْئًا وَاسِعًا. Truly, you have made a vast thing constricted, right? Because you're saying that Allah's good favor in terms of people being regarded with dignity and treated with dignity, it's really just for me and people like me. It's really just for me and people of my ethnic background, or for me and people of my class status, or for me and people of my madhab, right? I think it's
Right.
really, people of my tariqah,
Yeah.
right? Whatever. I think that is really the root cause of racism. That's what I think. And I think that, and many, secular um, um, researchers and thinkers have weighed in similarly, but of course using different language. One person said, I'm thinking of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, uh, you know, uh, anti-black racism. She said white supremacy is fear of genetic annihilation, right? Which is a different, it's kind of an unconscious, suppressed fear of genetic annihilation. That what like this idea of what's going to happen to me,
Wow.
right? And the cure is tawakkul. It's tawakkul. Just, you don't have to adopt some self-serving, other obliterating uh, way of existing in the world to secure your place. just tawakkal ala Allah, right? Tawakkal ala Allah. Fastajmilu fit talab. You don't have to do it like that. Right? You don't have to subjugate anybody to get yours. And that's what I really, really think it comes down to. And I think from that root, then all of the kind of post hoc justifications of that subjugation take place. Oh, it's because behavioral traits. It's not anything that I'm doing. It's because of the size of their craniums. You see, it's phrenology, right? Oh, it's not that. It's the fact that the Negroid is all of these, from the ancient and now outmoded things that sound ridiculous to us as justifications for the subjugation of Black people, to things that have a more modern tinge to them. Like, well, when you esteem basketball players more than you do scholars, this is how your community looks. All of this is just, I think, a post hoc justification for a racist disease that I think is deeply shaitanic.